You may notice today that I'm not my full, bright, vibrant self as I usually am, and I'm feeling a little bit of that weight. So I just want to speak to it up front. I had some big news came through a couple days ago. The spiritual leader of my faith community passed away, and there's a new leader that's been appointed, and so I'm kind of holding some grief, some celebration, some transitional energy. So I'm just like not my full self, but it's just, this is me grieving, actually. The one that we're going to talk about today is withdrawal and isolation. Because for many of us who are lone wolves, that is our go-to mechanism when things get hard, is that we kind of check out and we go and handle everything and then come back all shiny and fresh again. And so part of me being here today is like a demonstration and a reminder that even when things are hard, showing up in community can actually be really, really supportive if we're willing to take that risk and not maybe show up as shiny or as put together as we usually might be, and just show up as we are. So I wanted to start with that. A really tricky and sticky adaptation, which is withdrawal and isolation. And one of the reasons it's tricky and sticky for me is because it sometimes seems like a really good idea. It sometimes seems like, well, I'm not going to be very good company, so I don't want to really show up in this space. And in some environments, that makes sense, right? In some environments, there's a certain expectation, or maybe you're in some role that you have to perform, and maybe, that's made sense up until now. But in this community, what we're trying to open is a space where you get to show up as you are, even when you're struggling. So rather than going to that default of, let me just go away, hibernate for, 6 months to a year, and then come back into the world, it's like, come here and let us support you as you work it out. And this is really new for me too. Withdrawal and isolation isn't one of my go-to adaptations generally, but when things are really, like when the real shit hits the fan, that's generally what I do, is I withdraw and I huddle with like one or two people, right? That I feel that I can trust with my whatever, trust with my darkness, or trust with my not togetherness. And what I've been witnessing especially over the last week, but over the last 2 years with Monique in Texas, is this place where we can come into community when we're struggling, rather than pulling away from community and pulling away from contact and having these like privileged people that we're only going to hang out with because those are the only safe people. So it's a different experience. It's a really, really different experience. And one of the things that we've done with the other adaptations is look at, what's the silver lining, right? What's actually the skill set that we may have gained if withdrawal and isolation is one of our go-to adaptations. For those who might not be familiar yet with the concept of adaptations, adaptations are the behaviors and the perspectives that we develop when we're actually really, really little, to cope with an environment that's unpredictable or unsafe, or just to feel more of a sense of agency in our environment, right? And these adaptations can be really, really helpful in our context, in those contexts. But as we grow into adulthood and as we grow in our consciousness, those adaptations can become limiting, right? So I'll give you an example of withdrawal and isolation. My mom and dad used to fight a lot when I was little, a lot. And so there's two options as a kid, really, that I could see. You stay in the room or you leave the room. Like those are basically the only choices. I think I might have tried once or twice when I was really little to say something, and that resulted in like the fire coming at me. So my choices that were left are stay in the room or leave the room. And sometimes I would stay in the room, but most of the time, especially after my brother was born and when my sister, who was really little, was born, most of the time I would take everybody else out of the room. Right? So remove ourselves from from the pain point that was happening in the family. I mean, we could still hear them. And there's this really interesting research that kind of blew my mind that I found when I was a little bit older, around this, around like violence and abuse in the household. And even just yelling in the household. So children who stay and watch what's happening versus children who go in another room and can only listen to what's happening or only hear what's happening. The children who stayed and watched, here's the weird thing, okay? It's really weird. Up to a certain age, right? So up to a certain age, like once you hit a certain threshold, then it doesn't really matter whether you're in the room or out of the room. But those who left the room, they actually had a harder time in adult relationships when there was conflict than those who stayed and watched what was happening. And the theory is that when we were away, our imaginations got to decide what was happening. So you didn't actually see what was happening. Your imagination is deciding what's happening with the sounds and the yelling and whatever. When you stay and watch, it's like it's just happening. Still damage done in both situations, but in the ones where you're separate, where you remove yourself, there was actually like your imagination gets to make a story of what's happening, right? Which could be maybe worse than what's happening or whatever. So, I mean, I learned that years later, but what made sense to me as a little kid was get out of the, like, save the children, save the children, the other children, and get out of the room. And so it was adaptive for me and my siblings for us to not be physically there when things were erupting in our household. So withdrawal, removing ourselves, actually made sense, right? It had some other outcomes in the future, but in the moment, it was the thing that felt the least scary was to be out of the room. And that made sense. And that was the right thing to do for us in that moment. And the long-term impact of that is now when, and we're working through this, Faizan and I. So Faizan is comfortable expressing his anger. I'm less comfortable expressing my anger. And so when he expresses anger, my first instinct is to get out of the room. And over the years, I've learned how to get out without actually physically removing myself. So I check out. This making sense? I might not physically remove, but I turn off and I check out, which often makes him madder. And so this is something that we've as a couple been working through, right? That when his anger comes, like anger is a legitimate response to, it's like a feeling that comes up. It doesn't have to be dangerous. But my own story was that it was really dangerous when anger came up. And so the safe thing to do was to withdraw. And we're having to I think specifically the last 5 years since we've moved to Blind Bay, and he's had more space to actually navigate and heal some of this. I've also had to make space for okay, he's being comfortable to express the anger. I can't just shut down and check out. Can I stay present in the midst of this expression that's happening, that's activating some things from when I was little? So in our brain, when we're babies, there's this untouched forest. Okay. And there's no pathways. There's just lush forest. And life happens. We cry, we get picked up, we cry, we don't get picked up, we are hungry, we get fed, we are hungry, we don't get fed fast enough. All these things happen. The bathwater's too warm, the bathwater's too cold, whatever. All these things happen. Our hat flies away and our ears are cold for 3 minutes, but while our mom scrambles to get our hat back on, all these things happen. And as we experience these different events, these physical events in our environment as babies, certain pathways start to form in our brains. And so those pathways are I like to think of it as this little, I have a very active imagination, and I think there's little people in coffee machines and in the roller coaster, moving. So in our brains, there's this little person, this little being that's creating a pathway. And I think of it as a machete in the forest, just cutting down the trees and, just making space and making a path. And that's how it doesn't actually happen like that. Don't quote me. That's not neuroscientifically friendly, right? So there's these pathways that get formed in the brain. These trails that get cut in this lush, untouched forest, right? And over time, as we grow, we travel these pathways over and over again. And so as we get bigger and stronger, we make more space, and it's not just a tiny little, whisper of a trail, it's a bigger trail. And as we get older, that trail gets wider and the ground gets like flattened and it actually becomes a very well-worn path. And these paths just are and those are called like the automaticity or the automatic responses or the automatic behaviors, that just kind of, they're there. And it's really cool if you see it under a microscope when you see these brain cells, because it's like this brain cell gets activated and then this other one's over here, right? So it's like they're just sitting there like this, like these two brain cells. And then something happens over here and this brain cell goes, whoop, and it gets a lot enlivened and it starts like looking, and then it gets to a certain critical point and this other one goes whoop, and then they're like zzz, 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 and there's this electricity that actually flows. There's a chemical reaction that flows in between the brain cells, and there's an electrical impulse that actually passes through the brain cells. So that's what it looks very fascinating. And these are the pathways, right, that get like locked in when we do an activity like we just did, right? Where we're actually challenging those well-worn pathways. It's like we're walking down the well-worn pathway and like halfway through we go, wait a minute, the outcome is not the view, the vista that I'm going to get to is not the one I want. And I just cut in through the forest into this like uncharted territory. Like I'm actually quickly doing a quick turn and moving in a different direction. Now I got my machete out and I'm cutting a whole new trail. And that's why this work can sometimes feel very effortful, because it is. Cognitively, it's effortful to create new tracks in the brain, right? So this one is like going, it's like, and then it's kind of moving over. And instead of going, it's like, no, I'm going to go this way. And this whole other set of neurons gets fired and activated that has never happened before, right? And so this is what's really, 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 really so super critical about the work that we're doing. Just once isn't enough. Okay. The first time creates that initial like redirection, but we have to keep going on that pathway for that to become a familiar way. And that's why we're consistently teaching you the presence protocol, because we're teaching you how to really quickly get your brain into that space where it's not in survival mode and it can, oh yeah, I don't need to go in the survival mode tracks. There's this whole other vista that I haven't explored ever. And so the more we practice that, the wider those new pathways get and the easier it is to do that. And as time goes on, you might think back and say, I can't even believe I ever thought that way. I can't even believe I ever acted that way, because what happens actually in the brain, which is also really interesting, is that there's a word for this. It's called pruning. So like those old connections just kind of fall away. Those the way I visualize it in my mind is like that forest starts to grow in. Like those pathways that we've spent so many years developing, they start getting overgrown by new growth. And it's like a forgotten, and there's always kind of a whisper of that trail, but it's not the automatic place you go. And here's the hard part. When we're really under extreme stress, we might try to go back into those, but it'll feel very, very uncomfortable when we're trying to go back through those old pathways, because they've overgrown and the new one feels so much better. So that's where, Monique often talks about, or maybe Texas, about how when we've been living this way for, I think it's Texas, when we've been living this way for a while, the contrast feels very obvious. So we're just like a little bit off trail and we really feel uncomfortable. That's why cognitively that we feel so uncomfortable, because we've spent all this cognitive energy forming this new way of being that we know is better for us overall. And that old way it feels familiar, but it doesn't feel good anymore. And maybe it never felt good. So that's kind of the science of what's happening in the brain as we do these different exercises. And that's what happens when we drop something that's been something that we've been doing over and over and over and over again. When we drop that, there's room for something else to happen. And if we can be kind of open and intentional about the new being sometimes what happens is we drop the old, but we're still kind of like like I don't want that anymore, but I haven't changed, like I'm not aligned, and so then I get something else that's terrible. So that's not it either. It's like I can drop that and open and stay aligned, and then something new is given to me. It doesn't have to come, it doesn't have to like be generated by me. It's actually given to me. It's a completely different way. And yeah, the ego doesn't love that, because the ego likes to know everything and be in charge and be in control and give you all your answers. But it's such a different way to live. We're seeing this all the time with people, where with the intent, like the intention and the readiness and the openness, and people are like, oh wow. And we like, as a somebody who's trained in psychology, my training is that's not possible, right? However, my experience as a transpersonal therapist, when people come into alignment, when we enter certain states of consciousness, it is absolutely possible. Because when we remember, when we kind of tune into that who we really are, that is much, much beyond the physical processes of the brain and body, right? And so it's the closest thing we have in I mean, it's not mainstream, but the closest thing that mainstream science has to this experience is a psychedelic experience, right? Where you have like a total reset of the brain and anything is possible. But we also know that the state that people get to in psychedelic experiences can be replicated through meditative experiences. It doesn't have to be 3 hours of meditation. It's like
that's what I'm saying.
30-second presence protocol. We're doing this, and that's what's so exciting about this process that we're offering, is that it's like a shortcut to things that other people take like hours and hours and years and sometimes lifetimes to get to. We're able to get to it really quickly. What it requires, though, is like incredible courage and incredible perseverance. Like, do not let yourself be shaken off this path, because this is what's going to bring you to your freedom. And life is going to try to do stuff, and people around you are going to try to do stuff, but you have to be so determined to be like, no, I will not be tricked anymore to going off the rails. Like, I know who I am, and no one can take that away from me. So I'm very passionate about this, as you can see, because it's just like I feel like we found something here that I want to tell like the whole world about. That anybody can have this. It doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter your training. It doesn't matter your life experience. It doesn't matter how terrible your trauma has been. It doesn't matter how old you are. It can all shift really quickly. And so that's why our focus is so much on alignment, because when we're in alignment, that's when we have that readiness for the new, right? When we're not in alignment, we're actually living out the past. We're living out what's happened before, and we're just staying safe. Like as long as we're trying to stay safe, we don't have any room for what's available to us. This human is designed to maintain safety, like to stay alive, right? Like we're trying to stay alive. That's how we're programmed. But we're also designed for a much bigger experience than safety. It's our design. Like our brains and bodies are designed to access these experiences, and we've had them our whole lives. It's not like we just have them after, with an interaction with somebody like me. We've had these our whole lives. We maybe haven't called it the same thing, but we've had moments, each and every one of us, of alignment. And the more we seek that out, the easier life becomes.